Thunder. I hope everyone's safe and sound, but I look forward to a strong meeting and encourage questions from everyone around the table. Let's dig in and really learn today. Thanks.
Absolutely. I'm really excited for all these presentations that we have today. You can tell by the handouts in front of you, they work really hard to make sure that they are capacity on the information that you need. So are there any questions before we get started for the day? Anything that we need to be aware of? Okay, one small announcement. I know that Gil is planning on having lunch at Edgar's Grill. If any cab members are interested in going along, please let me know before too long. In fact, if you're interested in going now, please raise your hands and we'll just get a quick count. 1, 2, 3.
Is that the same place
4,
we went last time?
6,
No.
7,
It's a different one?
8, 9, 10.
You're like, oh.
There's about 10 of you,
Last one.
11 who are interested in going. Edgar's Grill is really nice. It's a teaching restaurant run by Goodwill. If you've never been, I highly recommend it. The food is outstanding and not particularly expensive given the quality. So if you do change your mind, let me know before too long. Let's not get all the way to lunch before you change your mind, okay? We're going to make a reservation for everybody. With that, any questions? No? Okay. Karen, are you ready? All right, let's go ahead and open up with Karen Adams. She's going to cover the D Area Ash project. This is a great update. I really enjoyed the dry run for this one. So I think you're going to appreciate everything Karen has to say. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I see what you did there.
All right, so I'm on. Back there talking, people will probably hear me. I'm going to set this right there. I have show and tell. Well, good morning. My name is Karen Adams. I work for DOE at the Savannah River site, and I'm the Federal Project Director for the D Area Ash Project. Sorry about that. I'm not sure if any of you have heard this presentation before. I gave it, the last time I gave it was in January of 2017 in Hilton Head, and I think a lot of the cab members have changed since then. So hopefully this is not a do-over for some of you, but I am going to start from the very beginning because this project has been underway since late 2014, and we're almost finished. And you don't know how happy I am. So here's some of the acronyms. Okay, so this is the area that I'm going to be talking about. So D area had a powerhouse. It was a coal-fired powerhouse. It ran for almost 60 years. And so as a byproduct of the coal, I'm going to skip down to 489D, the coal power runoff basin. Very low pH. The water that was in it, the soil that was in the bottom, there was some coal fines in the bottom. So what we did is we removed the water, removed the ash and the coal fines that were in the bottom, and we consolidated that and put it into 488-1D. We also kept that basin open for water management. And so now that basin has been cleaned to residential standards. It is permitted under stormwater management, and it collects water from about 65 acres. From the 1D basin is 40 acres. We did not need that large of a footprint for the ash to be capped. So what we did is we went, took the 489D fines in there, placed those in the east end of the basin. So that's the end closest to the U-shaped inlet basins, okay? So what we did, we consolidated the ash from the west end to the east end, okay? And I'll show you, I've got pictures galore at the end of this. You're gonna get tired of me talking here pretty soon, so I'm just gonna start showing you some pictures of progress in the field. But, and so the west end is going to be sloped and graded and seeded. It will not be a basin on the west end. We've taken the berms down, so it's not gonna hold water. And then the east end, where all the ash is, we're gonna cap it with a geosynthetic. Now, this project was in 2 phases, phase 1, phase 2. 488, 2D and 4D were phase 1. 488, 1D and 489D was second phase. And so during those 2 phases, we had two subcontracts. Same subcontractor though, won each contract. They used these 2 materials for phase 1, took it upon himself to go out and look for some different materials. Same end, and a cap, a geosynthetic cap, but maybe something a little easier to install, maybe a little bit quicker to install, and a little bit cheaper. And so they did. They found another product, and I have some samples of that as well. So you see, this is not real thick, but then this, even thinner. And both of these you roll out like carpet, but you get the same result. You get an impermeable barrier between rain coming in and the ash. So, already made a mess with my clay up here. Oops. Okay, so like I said, 2-phase project. Phase 1, we started in earnest in the field after we got a subcontractor on the site in February of 2015. We finished in September of 2016 with both of those facilities. Phase 2, we started March 31st of 2016, and we are scheduled, our baseline schedule, which we hope to beat, our baseline schedule is January of 2019. And so we hope to be through this fall. So the total project cost for all 4 facilities is $74.2 million. So here's a few milestones in the FFA that we actually completed ahead of schedule. So pretty much actions, field starts, and some field starts for all the facilities. Okay, so here's how much material, whether contaminated or capping material, that we used during this project. I'm just going to have you look at that later. I don't want to go through this. It's kind of getting really, into it. It tells you how many acres, square feet, what that relates to, like in dump truck loads and things like that. So a lot of material. We had, ash and contaminated soil. We moved 433,000 cubic yards of ash. So that's a lot of ash, but that's also 60 years of powerhouse operation. So we moved a lot of material. Okay, so this is page 11, and this is where you've sat for last probably 10 minutes of me chatting you up here. So this was the construction area prior to our field start. Not too bad. Some water, got some vegetation, but like I said, about a mile from the river. And so we got started in September of 2014. We were taking down the sluice line. We were prepping the site. We have a 40-acre borrow pit that's about 2 miles from this location in D area. Probably, I don't want to forward, I want this, out right here. Okay, and we had to develop that. And so we can get our fill material and our topsoil from that area. And so those activities took place actually before the subcontractor got there. And he got there in February of 2015 and started work. So this is kind of what it looked like before. All right, so this is us working in 2D. And so we remove the water. So wet ash is like wet sand, but worse. You sink in it, you know, heavy equipment doesn't really stay on top of it very good. It starts sinking. So these soil, I did it again. These soil air, I did it again. These soil area here, these roads, were basically how the heavy equipment could get to the ash in the middle of the basin without sinking. These were temporary. They took them up after they got done. So, and you can see 488 4D beside it, and some trucks there, how big it was. But we had very nice aerials all throughout this project. So this build a lot of these. It really shows you a better view of just standing on the ground because it's so big. But so here, 488 2D and 4D in November of 2015, getting the ash out of the bottom of the basin and placing it into 4D. Here it is, 2D, totally clean of the ash, and then they've started placing the geosynthetic material on 4D. Now with the products that they used in phase 1 for the geosynthetics, didn't want them to get rained on, didn't want them to get wet at all. So what they had to do, which kind of slowed them down in their placement, is at the end of every day they had to cover it with soil. So that meant they had not to uncover the whole thing, but at least an edge, and you can kind of see the edge right here, and that's where they would start the next day. So it took a little longer to place it. So this is what the geosynthetic cap looks like. All its layers. You've got the foundation, which is clean fill material, the clay layer, which is the impermeable layer, then you have the drainage layer, which basically filters the water out and takes it down the slopes to the drains at the toe of the cap, and then the soil cover, and then on top of the 20 inches of soil cover you have grassing. So that's what our phase 1 geosynthetic cap looked like. Okay, and here they just roll it out like carpet. Okay, little help with machines, but yeah. And that's the geosynthetic drainage layer. I didn't have that in the title. All right, so here's the finished product. 488 4D and 2D. So if you compare it to the picture on page 11, it looks a whole lot better. Okay, so, and that was in September of 2016. Throughout this whole 4 years of this project, it has rained. It has rained more than it has ever rained before. And it is still raining. And so even though we were ahead of schedule, water management was a big problem for us because we had to get the water out of the way and keep it out of the way to get to the ash. And so we dealt with that all throughout the project and are still dealing with it. And but after all that, we're still a little bit ahead of schedule. We're still eating it. We're eating into that ahead of schedule-ness right now. But still, we're thinking we're going to be done in October. Okay, so on to phase 2 and the 489D coal pile runoff basin. That was how it looked prior to us starting on my right. Okay, very low pH of the water in the soil. Nothing really grew. And so what we had to do was dewater the basin. So we had to treat it because it was so low in pH and also total suspended solids. So this facility right here was just a little temporary facility. They came in, filtered the water, and discharged the water after it was clean into the D area engineered canal, which runs kind of right back here. But so then we started excavating the ash. And so we had to test the ash to make sure it wasn't, it could go into the 1D landfill. It couldn't be too hazardous to go over there. It just had to be ash. And so we did those tests on the piles. You can see the piles here, kind of like a little staging area. And once we tested them and they passed, we took them over to 1D basin. So this is a picture here, what it looked like after the fines were excavated, and this is what it looks like after we completed. So totally different. So we excavated the coal fines, placed some clean fill in the bottom. We grassed it. We sodded the berms, and that's why they're so pretty so quick. And then it started collecting, the water from the area, and it still does that today. And so I have another picture of it at the very end with, it's very impressive. So 1D and its inlet basin. So 1D is going to get the cap. The west end, this end here, and the inlet basins here are going to be sloped and graded. And so instead of doing my hands here, that won't really mean too much. The west end will be sloped off to here. So all the berms around the sides. Because this is kind of misleading. The berms on this end here were probably about 15 feet from grade. These were built on grade when they were first constructed. And so those will be sloped off, and there's the Engineer Canal, or Beaver Dam Creek, runs through here. So those will be sloped off to where they'll go to that creek, and then the 488 inlet basins will also be cleaned, sloped off, and they'll also go into the Engineered Canal, which comes here, goes around, but the water runoff will go into the Engineered Canal from that. So the only part of the basin that will receive a cover is probably about this is the eastern half here, almost half, about 19 acres. So this is during taking out the vegetation, and it's kind of a soupy mess. It was really wet, so we had to keep the equipment above the ash. Sometimes that was difficult. And then just some progress through, this is October of 2016. This is them starting with the ash. And then see here we're almost done with consolidation of the ash from the eastern end to the western end. And so this is the new material that we're using as the geosynthetics for this cap. So you'll have I'm just going to call it a plastic liner that goes down first, and then their drainage layer over that, which is the drainage layer is the felt. Okay, so this was a little quicker, a little cheaper. We didn't have to put a 6-inch soil cover between the ash and this material, because this material could handle being close to the ash without a separation of the soil. And then we have the nodules here on the top, and plus this felt-like material on top of it, and that was the drainage layer. So there is a drainage system at the toe of the cap. Now they did have to weld the pieces at the seams, and so that's what these guys right here are doing. They really tested those welds, and I wish I had a count of how many samples they took and tests they did of the welds to make sure that they were actually welded together as they should be. This is them working here in the drainage area. This is the 20-inch soil layer here going on. Do it again in this slide. Okay. So here another aerial of just the west end in progress. The east end looking all clean with its fill material on the on the basin bottom. This inlet basin here has been closed. This inlet basin here we're still using as water management. Now that we have covered the ash with the geosynthetic material, we no longer have to consider the rainwater as wastewater. It's no longer in contact with the ash. But we still have water that's collected in the North Inlet Basin, and we still have to get rid of it. Now that we can only just discharge it as rainwater, we still have to make sure it stays gone, because we will have to dry that basin out, confirm it's clean, and then grade it and slope it like I was talking about earlier. So, and this is our borrow pit that I was talking about earlier, that we got our fill material and our topsoil from. And so, like I said, it's just 2 miles from where the project site is, and it is still within D area. So the trucks that bring the soil from the project site to the borrow pit, they have to make about a 4-mile round trip. And they've stockpiled, they use some of the clean areas at the construction site to stockpile some of the soil and the topsoil, so they won't have to make that 4-mile trip, even though it's not very far. It does save a little time. And so that was some of the work that they would do when it was too wet to work with the soil, or too wet to work with the ash, or too wet to work with the geosynthetics. They would stockpile some of the soil and the topsoil closer to the construction site, so they could get ready for when it did dry out. Okay, so summary, we've made good progress. Like I said, we're almost done. We have the geosynthetics down on 1D, which is our last facility that we're closing for this project. The 20 inches of fill material has been installed, and we're now working on this 4 inches of topsoil, and then the basin will be sodded. So the efforts will meet CERCLA and the state permit requirements for closure for all 4 facilities. And like I said, we're scheduled to be, baseline schedule is early 2019, but we hope to beat that. And we are, just cherry on top, we are a little under budget too. So I'll take any questions.
Well, let's start over here with Doug.
Good morning, Doug Howard Cap.
I'm sorry, I got one last, this is my coal pile runoff basin, my bird sanctuary. Sorry for the interruption. I'm proud, I can't help it.
Beautiful picture. The question I have is the lifespan of the material that you're using. What type of lifespan? I know they probably have individual as far as the different types of material.
You know what? I don't have that information, but I can get that for you. I know we have, I think our requirements is at least 30 years for these types of closure projects, but I think this material, and I'm guessing, and that's why I said I'm gonna have to get back to you, is longer than that 30-year requirement from the FFA and the state permit requirements.
Okay, and I have one more question. The borrow pit that you all use to, I guess, to do the backfilling, what are your plans for that?
We had, just like the project, we had 2 phases of the borrow pit, and basically it was cut down the center with the road. So phase 1 of the borrow pit, we pretty much exhausted it. So when we get done with the project as a whole, what we'll do is we'll just return that back to nature. We'll make sure that it's, it's graded, and it's, make sure that we won't have any erosion problems or anything like that, but pretty much it's been exhausted, so it'll just have to go back to nature. Now phase 2, we may actually have some material left over, and so we will probably use that for my next project, which is another ash project that starts in February of 2019. But when we exhaust that borrow pit as well, same thing, we'll just let it return to nature.
Thank you, great presentation.
Thank you, thank you.
Table, Larry.
Thank you, great presentation.
So basically, nothing was removed from the ash basin. It was all just regraded and capped and made safe.
Yes, but the north inlet basin, we didn't close it when we wanted to because per the schedule, because we had to leave it open for water management. And so now that it's still open and the cap is well close to being completed, there is coal fines and ash in that north inlet basin. And so what we're doing, and we're trying to get that basin smaller and smaller, is we're taking the coal fines and the ash that we removed from there, and we're taking it to Three Rivers landfill. So that'll be about 1,500 cubic yards of ash that we removed. A little bit more than what we thought we were going to remove from that basin, but we found a lot of additional ash during this project, and most of it was kind of brought into the project at a little bit of an expense, to the project, but we were able to handle most of it. Yeah, that's about 1,500
Okay.
cubic yards that went to Three
So,
Rivers.
so the contaminants that you're concerned with, mainly arsenic, I guess, is they're not water soluble at all. So as long as you can contain them, they're not going to dissolve in the water and run off with the water.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
And my last question is, there've got to be a lot of power plants scattered throughout the nation that have this.
Have a much larger, not we, but when those private entities had those releases into the environment, it really got the regulators and the public's attention. And so, a statute was passed because of that. So, yeah, they're having to address them.
Thank you.
Dave?
Dave Abakas, Cab. Thank you for your presentation. It's good to know such obviously dedicated people are working on these projects. On slide 11, I was just wondering which direction is the river and what's the terrain and what covers the ground between the project and the river? You say it's about a mile away, I think, right?
Right. Actually, if you look on the cover page of my package, I'm not going to flip through those slides because it's the very first. Thank you. Whoever did that. I could sit up here and be all day and still not get to the first page. It kind of gives you an idea of where the river is because it's right there. So this is about a mile. And so here is 4D, 2D, 1D, coal pile runoff basin over here. So that can give you an idea of how close / how far we are from the river.
Second question, please. The coal ash, this is on slide 5. It says the coal ash in D area basins and landfill do pose a human health and ecological risk. And as Larry mentioned, it's mainly arsenic, as you said. And then a little later, you said there was a little risk to public health and groundwater. Do you quantify that?
Well, it's a contamination migration risk to groundwater. If I threw public in there, sorry, because none of our water that we have at the site is used for public consumption, so I'll clear that up. What we have, and the groundwater cleanup is not part of this project, but we are addressing the groundwater in D area, and the contaminants that are in the groundwater is low pH. We do have some coal-related RADs, which is like radium-226 and 228, naturally occurring levels, and VOCs. But those were sourced from upgrading other maintenance facilities in D area, not from the basins. Now, coal pile runoff basin, yeah, you get your low pH, you get your arsenic because that was leached out because of the low pH. Most of the metals in naturally occurring metals in the soil were leached out because of a low pH. So you have those low levels in there. But but the ash basins themselves, like the landfill 2D, 1D, don't really see any groundwater contamination from those basins. Basically, like I said, upgrading it, because we had 488, I'm sorry, D area was also where we did heavy water production, which is a moderator. You have tritium, you know, because we came back, they shipped back the used moderator for recycling, had tritium in it. We got tritium in the soil, got tritium in the groundwater. Actually, those facilities have been remediated, D&D'd, and the soil under those facilities have also been remediated. So now we just have this plume that has emanated from those facilities, and we are addressing it. Mm-hmm.
I believe, Susan, is that your turn?
Susan Corbett, CAB. Thank you for this presentation. So, just a couple things. So I understand there's also some pretty substantial amounts of mercury and lead in coal ash. Is that not correct?
We don't see those contaminants in our soil or our groundwater associated with these facilities.
Why would that be? Because in other locations, coal ash is well known for containing a lot of lead and mercury. In fact, those as arsenic, those are the kind of three top contaminants in coal ash. Is there something different about this particular coal ash that it doesn't have high levels of mercury and lead in it?
I wouldn't know. I could get back to you on that if you would like, but I can't answer that.
So these things never biodegrade. I believe these are elements, so they stay forever in those forms. So once these liners are over 100 years or whatever, is there a plan to recap the surfaces as these liners wear away? Because these elements don't biodegrade.
Right.
Is there a plan down the road to?
As long as the government is the landowner of the Savannah River site, yeah, there will be a plan to maintain these facilities. Thomas wants to jump in. Thank you, Thomas.
Good morning, everyone. The industry standard on the liner, and Karen has already said that she'll get back to you on the specifics, but industry standard is usually life expectancy is 700 to 1,000 years.
Is there some source is there a name for this liner? Is it a patented product or something?
Yeah, and I could get those.
I would like to see that.
For you.
And the other thing too, so now what you're saying is that you are removing the risk of any migration into the groundwater. Once this process is done, there will be no more migration into the groundwater. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you.
That is our intent.
Joyce?
Joyce Underwood, CAB. Chelsea, could we maybe have slide 11 again? Because I have a question relating to that. Okay, in 488-1D, you said you moved everything from the west to the east, right?
Yeah, from this end to
was
this end.
the contaminant like all the way through it, so you just consolidated it on that end? Or did you move it? Oh, okay, so there was stuff where the trees were.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that 1D, don't let the trees and the water fool you. It was full of ash.
Which way is the, I know you kind of answered this already, but which way was the river?
The river is
where you're standing.
Is over here.
Okay, so you're moving it further from the river and doing that.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And then Narinder?
Narinder Malik, CAB. What was the pH of the coal ash?
I don't know the pH of the coal ash.
Because
I
normally,
can tell you the pH of the water in the soil that we've remediated is from the coal, but I don't know the pH of the ash itself.
because normally coal is very low pH.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the case, when you opened a landfill, was it a hazardous waste landfill or industrial waste landfill, or?
It was industrial.
But
It was permitted as industrial waste.
but it got the hazardous constituents in it there.
Mhm. And so we closed it, it was permitted as a class 2. We closed it as a class 3. And so that's why, because normally a class 2 is closed with a soil cover. We went a step beyond and closed it as a class 3 and did the geosynthetic.
When you put the liner, I believe it has to be about 100 mil liner on the landfill. Before you put that, how much the compaction of the actual coal ash before you put the liner?
I don't know. I know they had to compact it, and they did test on compaction and also moisture content, but I don't know the specifics.
And what's the thickness of clay on top of the liner?
There is a 20-inch soil cover on top of the geosynthetics. So the clay in the first geosynthetic is in here. It's sandwiched in between here. And so when this gets wet, it's like it expands and absorbs the water and keeps it from going through. And so the drainage layer just kind of disperses it over and through to the stormwater system in the ditches.
So have you established any schedule for the mowing on the landfill?
Well, they've actually started post-closure maintenance of the landfill and 2D already, since it has been closed for a few months. And so it has already been turned over to our post-closure care people in SRNS, and so they're already maintaining those. And the same thing will happen to 1D and 489D when we complete those. We'll turn that over to the post-closure care personnel of SRNS, and they'll take care of
One last question. What was the groundwater quality under the ash basin?
It was low pH. Low pH. But like I said before, that was basically from, I'm going to say low pH. It was VOCs and tritium as well, but that was from an upgradient source, not from the basins themselves. But now under the coal pile runoff basin, basically the low pH came from the coal pile runoff basin.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions for Karen? Gil, right behind you.
Where are you?
You're-
Sorry.
You mentioned your next project starting in 2019.
Yeah.
What-
Ooh.
Okay, good. You're excited
Hey.
about it. Can you tell us a little bit, Gil Allen's with Cap, can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, it's smaller, but it is ash, and it's in P area, and it's Dunbarton Bay is the simple answer to the title of it, and it's ash that was supposed to go in the P area ash basin, because P area had a coal-fired powerhouse as well, like all the industrial areas around the site. They had its own powerhouse, and so the P ash basin was closed during recovery, and while they were out closing the P ash basin, they discovered an overflow area. So it was too large to incorporate it into that particular project, the P ash basin project, and so we put it in the FFA and as its own separate project. And so now it's come up. We did the schedule for the project has changed a lot, over the last few years, but now it's come up, and we've actually moved it forward in the FFA schedule. And so we're planning right now, and shovel in the ground day is in February of 2019. And so it's 15 acres, but it's vegetated, so we'll have to go out, take the vegetation down, and we're actually going to remove the ash and take it to Three Rivers landfill. And so there's a Carolina Bay associated with this project. It also has ash in it, but we're just going to leave that alone since it's a wetland. And but we're going to remove the ash that's around it. So, but yeah, that should start in February.
Carlos?
Carlos Cato, CAB. The installation of the micro drain system, is that a visual inspection system? So I have a two-part question. Is that a visual inspection system? And then what type of ongoing maintenance does this require?
Well, when they install the micro drain and also the I want to call it a liner, but it's, where it's a cap, but so they had to weld all the seams, which basically they melted the seams together. And they did a destructive test, and they also did another test where they blew air down the seams to make sure they didn't have any air escape from the seams. And so they did on-site test, but they also took samples of the welds, took them off site for testing as well. Like I said, they did a lot of testing of these seams, and it's just for 20 acres of this, they did a lot of testing. So does that answer your question about the micro drain and the, or no? Sorry.
Well, I was just curious if it were a visual inspection system. So is the micro drain the actual geosynthetic material that was placed on top, or was that something separate?
No, that was part of the geosynthetic system, because it's a two-part system. So you have the micro drain, and then the drainage layer goes on top.
So the material you have in your hand there is the micro drain. Okay.
And so this is actually sitting on top of the ash, like my hand is the ash, and then you have, this is the impermeable layer, and then you have these little nodules on the top, plus this felt acts as the drainage layer, which keeps the water away and takes it to the collection system, the trenches along the side. Okay, and then as far as maintenance, like I was saying earlier, once this is going to be covered with 20 inches of clean soil and then sod, and so it'll look like a grassy mound like the other ones did, and then we'll turn that over to, when this project is complete, we'll turn it over to post-closure maintenance, and they will do monthly inspections. Basically all that is a visual inspection. They'll do monthly walk downs of the caps to make sure, and then I'm not sure of how often, but they'll also mow the grass, but they'll make sure like there's not any ant beds, there's not any burrowing animals, there's not any trees growing. They'll make sure it's just grass, and a few weeds. But they'll keep it mowed, so they can also, they can visually inspect it.
Narendra, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I have one more question. Narendra Malik Cab, I should have asked this question in continuation. Do you have a leachate collection system in the landfill?
We do not.
Thank you.
Now remember, it's not a sanitary landfill, it's just ash. Okay, so that leachate, we don't have that leachate collection as a sanitary landfill would.
Thank you.
Anything else, folks? Okay. Thank you, Karen.
Okay.
So while she's picking up, let me introduce our next speaker. This is Dr. Gene Rhodes. He's from, it's okay, we'll get that later. He's from the Savannah River Ecology Lab, and he's going to give you a presentation on the pollination activities that they do on site. So, Dr. Rhodes, forwards, backwards, laser.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to give you a talk today about pollinators and activities on the SRS. And this is not a normal talk for me because you usually hear from me talking about the status of the lab or other issues. So a couple of confessions up front. One is I've been sick for the last few days, so I'll try and speak clearly. there are a number of different groups that have a hand in pollinator activities on the site. And I'm going to do my best to sort of talk a little bit about what each of those groups is doing. So if I make if I omit something, then my apologies in advance. But I did reach out and look to see what I could find out for groups other than ours that are working on pollinators. So what I thought I would do is walk you through the pollinator decline in the U.S., some of the issues surrounding it, some of the reasons we worry about pollinators, and then talk about current pollinator activities on the SRS, and then proposed pollinator research and management activities on the SRS. And the reason for that third part is that as you go through the talk, you'll realize that there are some obligations that occur with most federal land management agencies, or most federal agencies that have land that they manage. And we've made some proposals to DOE for some of the things that we think could be done to enhance pollinators on the site, and I'll talk about those. But first, let's talk about pollinator declines. So honeybees, you know, most people are very familiar. When you think about pollinators, you think about honeybees. And one of the things that's important with honeybees is about $10 billion worth of crops in the U.S. are pollinated by honeybees. As many of you are aware, there are a lot of people that are beekeepers that keep their hives associated with agricultural crops that are heavily dependent on pollination for success. There have been declines in these guys over the last decade, but what's interesting to note is that of the 100 or so crops that make up most of the world's food supply, only 15% are pollinated by domestic bees. The other 80% are pollinated by wild bees and other wildlife. So we have a vast mixture of different types of pollinators out there, and anything that affects either the domesticated bees or the wild pollinators affects our ability to feed ourselves, affects the native biodiversity, and a lot of different things. I'll scatter pretty pictures through here as we go. This one caught my eye. It's just sort of that visual of as these guys go in and feed. It's very easy. It's a mechanical operation, right? They go from flower to flower. They carry the pollen with them, and the world turns. So it's a very interesting process. And anything that impedes that impedes the plant's ability to reproduce. So if you think about that 80% that's out there just sort of happening in the background, about 100,000 to 200,000 different species play a role as pollinators other than our domesticated bees. That's a staggering number. It was for me, right? I'm a scientist. I've been working on all kinds of things all my life, and I really started to dig into this, and I never really thought about it. They play roles in about 250,000 kinds of flowering plants on the insect. Bees, wasps, moths, butterflies, flies, beetles, but we also get over 1,000 species of vertebrates like birds and mammals that serve as pollinators, and things like hummingbirds, perching birds, flying foxes, fruit bats, possums, lemurs, even lizards. So we get this wide range and diversity of species that serve as pollinators. So you can begin to see how the changes in diversity of various types of species, be it vertebrate or invertebrate, like our insects, can affect our ability to maintain native plant diversity and agricultural crops. So one thing that we do know for sure is that pollinators support biodiversity. There's a correlation between plant diversity and pollinator diversity. That just makes sense because many of these species of plants are dependent on the pollinators to reproduce. So without the pollinator, you get no reproduction, you get drastic declines in certain species. One thing that you need to understand is that not all plants are as dependent on pollinators as others. So you'll see shifts in plant communities depending on the availability of pollinators and the vulnerability of the plant to missing pollinators. Some species of plants are very dependent on one or two species of pollinators, a particular species, right? So if those species disappear, the plant disappears. There's a wide range of different relationships among pollinators. So for migratory pollinators such as bats, hummingbirds, monarch butterflies, it's really important to identify what they call nectar corridors. And this was very familiar with me because I did my PhD on waterfowl, okay? And I got to thinking about this in terms of waterfowl. So when you manage waterfowl, you have to manage them from their breeding grounds to their wintering grounds and back. So you can't just have good breeding grounds or good wintering grounds. You've got to have good places for them to stop, rest, and eat along the way. And if you lose the places along the way, you lose the waterfowl. It's the same thing for these guys. If you don't have good places where they can obtain food and nectar on their migration routes, you lose them because they die during migration. So for all of these species of invertebrates and bats and hummingbirds that serve a big role in pollination, we not only have to worry about where they breed and where they winter, we have to worry about all of the places in between. And that's a relatively new concept. So for the last couple of decades, we've really thought about this, but we're only beginning to think about it in terms of pollinators. So it makes it a much more complex problem. I can have the best pollinator gardens in the world here where they breed or where they winter, but if other people aren't providing that interior habitat so that when they move, they can survive, we lose them. So it's a really big issue. And just some pictures of some of these guys. You know, I'll talk a little bit about some of the reasons for the decline, but one of the guys that we're really worried about is a monarch, for example, some species of moths. We have hummingbirds. Most of you are familiar with hummingbirds. They're a big pollinator, and even bats for some specific species. So just to throw another monkey wrench in, about 3 bat, 5 bird, 24 butterfly, skipper, or moth, 1 beetle, and 1 fly species are federally listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act of 1973, and they're pollinators. And it's unknown how many of the listed plants that are endangered are associated or require pollinators. One thing that's sort of missing here is that we have done a really poor job of documenting the declines in many of the invertebrates, like these pollinators. So unless they're really high profile invertebrate species, many of those we have very little information on in terms of their population sizes or whether they should be threatened or endangered. So if you're looking for a group where we probably have underrepresented threats, this is it. And we're starting to see that now because of the pollination issues. So I'll switch and talk about some facts. And as you can see, I've pulled many of these from, so this is status of pollinators in North America for the National Academies Press. So there's evidence of decline in the abundance of some pollinators, and it varies among taxa. We know that. And long-term pollination trends for some of the wild bee species, particularly bumblebees. So let me just do a very informal, absolutely unscientific survey. How many of you noticed a decline in bumblebees since you were a kid? Okay, all right. You can remember when you were a kid, there were bumblebees everywhere. We had a lot more clover, right? We had a lot more things. Now we got a lot more manicured lawns. We don't see these guys. So we know that some of the bumblebees species are declining, and butterflies, bats, and hummingbirds are downward. For most, though, there's very much a paucity of long-term population data, and we don't even know the basic taxonomy and ecology of some of these species to make definitive assessments of the status of the species. So when I first got into wildlife ecology, back when, you know, the Model T was common, right? So when I first got in, there were a lot of people that did natural history. And when I say natural history, you're talking about somebody who would spend their entire career studying the taxonomy and ecology of a bug, right? Like a pollinator. They were an entomologist who they were interested in science and the discovery about the animal. Over time, the way we do science, the emphases have changed, and we have a decline over time in people who can spend their career doing that kind of thing. So we have a loss of expertise in people who have in-depth knowledge of the natural history of species. And because of that, we now face, when we have declines or trying to make decisions about declines, we have a lack of data, and sometimes we don't even have experts who know enough about that species group to provide us with the information we need to fix the problem. All right? And I don't know how we fix that problem. It has to do with the change in education, the change in in the way funding is provided, the change in the emphasis in terms of the places that are hot topics in science and how you make a career. So if you look at millions of hives, I just pulled one representative slide. This is millions of hives for honeybees from 1946 to 2006. This is one of the things that's got people really upset, right? We've seen change. You know, there are lots of reasons for that. Some of the reasons have to do with changes in agriculture. Some of them have to do with the changes in numbers of beekeepers. But a lot of it has to do with changes in the species themselves and the numbers. And I'll talk about that. But this is the kind of graph you do not want to see if you are a farmer who's dependent on pollination, right, for your crop success. Right? That's not something you want to see, because what it's telling you is that the pollinators available to for you to make a living are decreasing nationwide. And there are maps that show how this changes all across the U.S. I decided not to talk about that, but there are hot spots all over the U.S. where we see declines in pollinators and interactions with agriculture. So if you talk about the cause of the decline among wild populations vary, but species are generally difficult to assign. There's no one big smoking gun, right? There are many. And that's generally the way it is. Pathogens have spilled over from commercially produced bumblebees. For greenhouse pollination, they contributed to declines in some native bumblebees. There are pathogens in the wild honeybee, in the domestic honeybees. So diseases. Diseases are one issue that we know, particularly some viruses, are causing declines. But other factors for which there's convincing evidence include habitat degradation and loss, particularly for bats, bees, and butterflies. So I'll go back to my wildlife roots and give you one that drives me crazy. So I go into an agricultural community in the South, and I go knock on a farmer's door, and we get to talk, and he goes, "Man, there just aren't any quail here anymore." And I go, "Well, yeah." He said, "Well, I don't understand. Why aren't there any quail here anymore?" And you look out there, and this was particularly in the Midwest. You look out there, and there's nothing but agricultural fields. There's a fringe on the drainage ditch about 1 foot wide, and everything is gone. And I look at them, and we get to talking, and I begin to explain to them that you basically took all their habitat away. In other words, you can't expect it to live here if there's nowhere for it to live. All right? So it's the same thing with these pollinators. We have gotten, I'll just say it, weed phobic, right, in the U.S. When it comes to agricultural landscapes in particular. We see those as a nuisance. We see them as an impediment to our ability to make money. We see a abandoned lot. What do we want to do? We want to cut the grass, right? So we have moved to a point where we've taken that we've made them marginal habitats at best, and we take those away every chance we get. Okay, so I'm not blaming people, right? What I'm saying is we haven't thought about what the value of one versus the other is. Is it more valuable to have a little bit of a weed kept area, or is it more value to have the pollinator, right? And if joy, or being able to make a living as a farmer, I might want to keep a little of the unruly stuff, right? Because that helps us in the end, both as a species and the ecological diversity on the planet, as well as our economic income if I live in an agricultural landscape. Consequences of the decline. I said we sort of some pollinators. In other words, is there a daisy species, or is there a wild rose species, or is there something else that's not there anymore, and I just don't notice it because it all seems lush? Well, we don't know, and those are hard to define. But one important result could be the vulnerability of some plant species to extinction, and certainly agricultural fertilization of plant success. So if you look on the web, you can U.S. You can see how the agricultural Midwest, there's a number of smaller species, particularly bumblebees, and if you remember and you think about bumblebees, they don't call on one side. They're the big ones. They're the small ones. There are lots of different wild bumblebees, and some of those are almost gone. So in terms of the consequences of the decline, what can we do? Well, one of the things that we need is monitoring. Long-term systematic monitoring is necessary to actually determine whether there are trends in species abundance and richness. That allows us to understand the relationship between the communities and the putative causes of changes. And those relationships have to be understood in developing plans to mitigate or manage species. So I hate it. We need more data. Well, we do. All right, we do. I mean, so you're talking about a group of species that or not, there is a significant reason to blow the alarm and say we're going to lose something that provides. So how many of you know, so just think you know for sure what an ecosystem service is? Okay. Bees, these guys provide an ecosystem service. That ecosystem service is they pollinate, right? So they pollinate plants. So, and that means they maintain plants. They go away, the animal pollinated plants, they all go away. So if we want fewer of those plants, fewer of these results in that. So one of the things that we have to do is figure out whether or not there are long-term trends in declines. And unfortunately, this has not been a species group that we have that kind of data for. All right, we're getting it. There's a bigger emphasis. We're starting to get it. I see that as a role for public lands in trying to help with this crisis. Okay, conservation and restoration. I won't go through all of this, but the bottom line is, if you want to restore and conserve these guys, you got to know something about them. So notice a theme here. The theme is we don't know if to at least make good best management practices, recommendations to people who manage lands that are important to pollinators. And that includes the private sector, the public sector, everybody. And we need those. We know there's a problem, but we don't know exactly how to fix it. All right? And so one of the things that we have to do is go in and figure out what kinds of things make the biggest bang for our buck. And I think that's where we stand now. That's a need that we have. So if you look, one of the things that sprung up, many of you probably seen this, you can find, now that we sort of know pollinators are in trouble, things that come in and talk about attracting native pollinators, putting up pollinator habitat, various seed mixes, big initiatives by the USDA and NRCS to try and maintain more habitat for pollinators, particular groups, books, the whole 9 yards. There's just been this outpouring because most people realize, we enjoy our plants, we enjoy our flowers, and we enjoy our pollinators. And the fact and the idea that we might be losing them from an aesthetic point of view is quite concerning. And from a commercial point of view in the farming country is a big area of concern. Okay, so what are we doing now on the Savannah River site? So before I jump into that, let me tell you a little bit about why it's important. There's a national strategy for maintaining pollinators or recovering pollinators across the U.S. It started by Obama, I think in 2014. They created a national strategy, and most of the land management agencies or those federal groups that hold significant amounts of land have appendices to that document that tell that add in what we're going to do, right? What we're going to do to help. D has one, it's Appendix E to this national document. To enhance pollinator habitat, this is something they started a few years ago. They'll pick areas around the site and they'll put about an acre here and an acre there, do about 10 of them. Since 1994, they put native grass plugs in various places, from 20 to 130,000 plugs per year to reestablish some type of cover on barren areas. And their planting practices are adjusted to encourage a diverse existing plant population. There are lots of different ways. I won't go into silviculture 101 because I probably am not qualified to teach it, but there are lots of different ways you can cut and lots of different ways you can plant trees. And so what they're saying is they're taking strategies to repopulate trees that actually do not exclude other plant populations that also might use that space. And if you've ever noticed, when you drive down the road, you see a clear cut, right? Some clear cuts are different than others. Some of them they left seed trees. Some of them were actually planted. Some of them were naturally repopulated. And all of them have different plant communities as a result of that. Another thing that's going on is something we're doing collaboratively with the U.S. Forest Service. So the SREL is working with the Forest Service. Forest Service got about $30,000 from the regional office to effectively engage children on outdoor learning and sustained outdoor experiences. So what we did is we serve as their lead partner on an initiative called Let's Grow Together. It's a pollinator initiative where we connect students to nature, provide every kid in a park passes for fourth graders, so that allows these kids to access these natural areas, enrich the STEM curriculum to reinforce the importance of sustainability and reach students from a myriad of backgrounds. So there's an educational component to this where we're coming in and we're providing educational resources for the children, but we're also establishing pollinator habitat, all right? And so this is a seed mix. So one of the things that we're doing, seems like I'm hung, all right? There you go. Students will develop and maintain pollinator gardens and mentor younger students in after-school programs with their gardening efforts. So we're also creating a model pollinator garden at the SREL UGA Conference Center, and we'll use that as potential seed sources for all these demonstration plots at schools. So that initiative, we just hired the coordinator for that. So now we're actually moving out into the schools, establishing the STEM curricula, and now we're starting to establish the pollinator gardens at these schools, as well as a pollinator trail in addition to the garden at SREL. So we've added that to our outreach component so that folks that come there can also then be taken down a pollinator trail so we can show them native plants that are really good for pollinators. A last one that's ongoing is there's been research on and off for many, many years on the site by groups from different universities other than University of Georgia, and one of them is Michigan State University. And they have an ongoing large-scale experiment where they're interested in, as you restore longleaf pine ecosystems, they're asking a number of questions, but one set has to do with pollinators. So they're collecting and preserving pollinating insects, especially bees, across experimental plots where longleaf has been reestablished. They're conducting a field experiments with plants to understand how pollination services vary across the landscape, and conducting observations and experiments to better understand the pollination biology of native plants in this system. So their focus is really on establishing longleaf. When you reestablish longleaf, what kind of communities inhabit that and how do they work together? So I'll give you a visual here. They're doing what we call network analysis. And a network analysis is pretty straightforward. It can be very simple, right? It can be that we know this particular bee species uses 2 or 3 plants. This one uses 1 plant. This one uses 2 or 3. Or it can be highly, highly, highly complex. And that's what it tends to be, generally, highly complex. So what you're trying to figure out are how the plants and the animals are connected. And so they're actually looking at who visits who, right, in terms of the plants and the pollinators, to see where we have really strong networks of pollinators for certain plants and where we have really weak networks of pollinators. So let's say there are certain species of plants out there that are used by only 1% of the available pollinators and others that are used by 40% of the other. So if we need some effort, where do we need it? We need it where there's very little redundancy in that network. And that's the kind of work that they're doing. Okay, so with that sort of gives you a background on the issue. It gives you a background on DOE's mandate. It gives you a background on some of the things that we're doing. So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the things that we've proposed that we think could be done and why I think that's important. So we'll talk about the assessment of the current value of SRS habitats to pollinators and inventory of pollinator species diversity within those habitats, assessment of value of habitat improvements. So I'll just go through it in layman's terms in the way I think about it. What aren't we getting credit for? Okay? We have a massive site that has all these different habitats on it, and we don't have a good handle on what pollinators are there and which ones are using which habitats. Let's figure that out first. So if you go back to DOE or EPA or whoever's driving the initiative, we can say, here's what we have, here's what we've got, and this is where they are. The second question is there anything I can do to make it better? All right? So let's say an easy example of right-of-ways. Let's say I've got right-of-ways. I got 9,000 acres of right-of-ways on the site. Many of those are in native plants. So if I go in and take 2 acres of a right-of-way, plow it up, and plant a native pollinator mix, do I get more pollinators or not? Right? And the third part is, does it matter where I do it? If I got 2 mature pine stands on either side and I put the pollinator mix in the middle, maybe nothing changes. But if I got a clear cut and a riparian area, maybe everything changes and all of a sudden I got jackpot, right? So what don't we know? We don't know what we have. We don't know that changing anything will make a difference. And we don't know where we need to make the changes to make a difference. So those are the 3 things that I think are important. All right. So if you're going to do that, what would I consider the high value targets? Red cockaded woodpecker management areas are high value. It's long term, it's thinned, it's burned regularly. It's an excellent habitat where you get this really diverse understory, right, of pollinator species. We already think what stands for growth. So we'll make sure we do in the new light section of that. Or would it be more value if it ran right through the middle of that low early succession habitat, right? I don't know. But I think it's important because that tells us how we manage the landscape in the future to maintain enough pollinator habitat to keep things going. Intermediate value, mature pine, intermediate and mature pine forests. I mean, so everybody, you know, I think of this as second nature because of the way what I was taught in school. But what you realize is why does a mature forest look like this? Why? Because it blocks all the sunlight to the ground, right? A mature forest has these big canopies and all these leaves. Sunlight during the growing season it doesn't get down here. And if it doesn't get down here, nothing grows down there, right? So you don't get in these mature forests understory full of these nice pollinator-friendly species. You just don't because the sunlight is restricted. So that's a habitat where improvements potentially could be made. And riparian habitats, the same issue. You get more of it, but it depends on the age of the timber around it. They tend to be mature bottomwood forests. You get some really good pollinator species, but you don't get as much diversity. And in low potential existing planted turf areas like buffers and cap waste areas, you know, it remains to be seen whether we could do anything with cap waste areas, but they're still a low value because this is what you have, right? You're mowing it. It's not a high value for most pollinators. If it were moved to something like clover or something other shallow rooted species, there's studies ongoing now that can tell you there might be other species that could be plugged in here that would be much more valuable. Even if it's just around buildings, right? It might take what needs to be mowed into something that's high value. You get a lot of credit for it, and it has less maintenance. And in newly remediated sites, they were just talking about D area, right? They're going in and they're remediating. They put the caps in, but there's a lot of construction material around there, so you get these areas that now you get these areas that are now replanted in grass because you just want to hold the soil. What if we're thinking about the next step in not just grass, but what could we put there that actually starts to increase pollinator habitat and hold the soil and lower our maintenance costs? That's where we need to be. Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to upset you back there. All right. Value added. So a couple of things I'll end with. One is increased awareness of the current potential value of SRS pollinators is an activity that not only contributes to the national debate, but it also helps us with our mission on the Savannah River site as a national environmental research park. Savannah River site is the first national environmental research park. So understanding these kinds of issues are really important, right, to the contribution that we can make nationally to that effort and to that network. And so one of the things that I'm going to do at the November CAB meeting is I'm going to talk about the status of SRS as a National Environmental Research Park. Tom French asked for some information on this, and I've started to dig deeper into this. The SREL has always sort of led that piece of the puzzle here on the site, and I'm going to try and give you an overview of what's happening and what we could do. And one of the things that I see down the road is if we do sort of enhance our profile as a NERP, doing things like this that contribute to the national dialogue on important issues are places we could do it and kill two birds with one stone. Not that I'm going to kill the birds, but okay. Just so you know. All right. All right, with that, I'll take questions.
Let's start with Mary.
Mary Weber, CAP. Thank you, Dr. Rhodes. I always look forward to having you here.
Thank you.
I seem to recall that maybe 3 or so years ago, the CAB had a recommendation regarding planting on the caps. And can you give us an update on that, or is that part of what you might be doing in November?
Number one is I wasn't part of that response, so I don't know anything about that particular recommendation, but I can find out. And if you would like, I can certainly incorporate what was responded to into my talk in November.
Thank you.
You bet.
If someone wants to clarify for me, but if I recall correctly, I think the reason why they didn't want to plant on the caps is because roots might penetrate through.
That's correct.
Yeah.
I mean, the big broad issue is as I understand it, because I've had that discussion, is that they're more concerned about the root penetration of the synthetic liner, which would then that would obliviate the role of the liner, right? So the whole role for those liners is to shed water so it doesn't percolate down. The question is, can you get something that's shallow rooted, something that you wouldn't have to worry about making that? And I think there are questions for us to answer. We've got people at the ecology lab that actually have done some research in that area. So I understand the concern, and until you are absolutely sure, you don't want to do it, but there might be options.
Thank you.
Jim.
Jim Gill, CAP. There's been a lot of information about colony collapse disorder for domestic honeybees. I've kind of lost touch with that. Could you bring us up to date on what current thinking is?
No, I can't. I'm not even going to shoehorn that one. I'm not an entomologist, so that to the extent I know about colony collapse, but I know absolutely nothing beyond the fact that it exists. I apologize, but I can't answer you that one. But I can find out and send you some information.
Larry.
Thank you, Larry Powell, CAB. Dr. Rose, I too always look forward to your presentations. You're very thorough. I am a beekeeper, and I would encourage anybody in here that wants to get into something really interesting. It doesn't cost much money to get into it, doesn't take much time, but you just learn a wealth of information. One of the things that, in your thoroughness as usual, you left out a huge thing, in my opinion.
Sure.
Is the use of pesticides.
Yeah, I did. I didn't. Yes.
We're right in the middle of the Peach Belt, and if you ride down the road on 278, you see these huge tractors with these machines behind them spewing out insecticides everywhere, and that insecticide is not going for a specific target. It's killing everything in sight.
That's right.
My question is there a person at Savannah River Plant who is in charge of insecticides? Like if you were to have a pine beetle problem, is there somebody that says we need to fly over it with an airplane and spray a certain area? Is there somebody that is in control of the overall effect?
So I'll do two things. One is there are folks who track the use of the pesticides for permitting purposes because they're only permitted to use so much of the various types per year on the site. There are multiple entities that could use those pesticides as well. So I'd have to defer it to DOE to answer if there is someone, because I know for wetlands there is, right? So for wetlands, there's a committee that oversees how wetlands are treated, and if there are going to be pesticides or herbicides or anything used on those, they track it and they know it. I've got one of my folks who's licensed as an herbicide for a herbicide applicator license, but we can't do that without making sure that people know what we're doing and how much. I'm assuming that's the case for everybody else because the Forest Service would be a big user of certain pesticides. They also treat fire ants, right, on the caps. But I think that all funnels back to DOE.
So Mike McElhaney, DOE. We'll get you the answer to that. SRNS does have folks who manage and regulate the use of pesticides across the site. because it is a permitted activity, but I don't have that information here now.
But one thing I'll follow up just on that. You're exactly right. It was in here, but it didn't get out here. There were two pieces I left out. One is like the monarch butterfly. So you talk about these other reasons for the decline. Genetically modified plants got the monarch butterfly, right? Turned out that when they changed in the plant, the pollen was toxic to the butterfly. And then the other, I know. And then the other is the pesticide. So EPA really is the driver of this pollinator initiative nationwide, and the reason they are is because of the pesticide issues. A lot of these are non-discriminate, and it might take out your target, but it takes out everybody else too. And so that's a big issue, and one that part of this national pollinator initiative. If you go to the EPA appendix, they talk about that extensively, right? And they're part of the puzzle. So you're dead spot on.
Thank you. And conclusion, this is just my opinion, but I think it's a lot more important to find out what's killing the bees than what's attracting the bees.
Yeah.
I do think it's very important to plant plants for the pollinators, but I think we're killing them faster than we're helping them reproduce.
We may be for the bee side, but there may be the bigger. And I sort of agree exactly what you just said with bees, but for that bigger pollinator community, I think they just don't have anywhere to live.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's go down here. Susan, is that yours?
Thank you, Susan Corbett, CAB. So it sounds like you haven't really done like a count or anything. I know you probably can't count, but like you do birds, but has there been no assessment of how many pollinators you currently, like per square acre or square mile or something?
There's some data on that. So as part of, for example, the Michigan State study, in the study areas that they're working with in longleaf pine, they have a good idea what that community is. But that's just one small habitat on the larger site. So for riparian areas, for various stages of other pine species, for right-of-ways and those types of things, the data are much more spotty, right? There might be a little data here, a little data there, but no comprehensive look at what we actually have.
So what they did find, the numbers that they did study, how did those compare with other areas nationally?
They haven't published it yet, so I haven't seen their numbers.
Okay, and we also know that pollen can carry radionuclides. Is that something that you will be looking at in your study?
I hadn't planned on it.
I think you should.
Well, I'll look into it. Yes,
Thank
thanks.
you.
All right. Joyce?
Joyce Underwood, CAB. My question concerns the right-of-ways.
Yes.
It is my understanding, and this could be wrong, that high-tension power lines like that let off some kind of radiation. So if you were to plant the pollinator flowers, wouldn't that mess with the pollinators?
No, not necessarily. I mean, you have, let me just start with, this would be a question best answered by an electrical engineer, right?
I'll ask my husband.
Yeah, okay, ask your husband. But I think I think we have more of a risk, right, in terms of the low-level areas that we're working at with, for example, vertebrate pollinators and wires. So I did a fair amount of research earlier in my career on power line collisions with birds and bats and all those types of things, right? A lot of that can be driven by communications towers and lights. But I have seen no data that indicate the right-of-way issue associated with decline of, with the issue you just brought up with the decline of pollinators. So from what I know, I don't know of anything there that would cause a problem.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Dawn?
Dawn Gillis, CAB. Some of the interesting things you were talking about with maintaining clear cutting and replanting, there's a 70-acre piece of land behind my property that has not been used very much, and within the last year they clear cut it, and the rumor has it they're going to plant it some kind of pine, and I'm not sure what variety of pine. About a month, 6 weeks ago, they're back there spraying with a helicopter. And I mean, big helicopter. They had big trucks out there, and the helicopter landed on the truck where they could refill the tanks and then go back out and just spray. And, you know, I've got my horses and my farm right there, and all of us all around were going, what the heck's going on here? Everything's turning brown.
Yeah, that's
So,
probably
nothing.
herbicide.
Totally, yeah, it's just herbicide, yeah, it's just totally indiscriminate, it's all gone.
Yeah. And I've seen site preps like that. That's not you know, there are lots of different philosophies on that. I tend not to be on that side in terms of site prep, but what they're probably going to do is go in with mechanical planters or something, and to do that, they try and kill all the competition before they put them in.
And about half that land had been farm land for years, but hadn't been used. It was starting to grow back up.
Yeah.
And a lot of the woods were old woods. They came back there. I was back there when they were clear cutting. They had those big machines that just kind of went around and grabbed a bunch of trees and cut them off at about 6 inches.
Yeah, we're really good at it.
Oh, it was pretty. I mean, it was like the Avatar movie.
But
you know?
let me say this, and so there's no one. Every particular case has its pros and cons, right? So one of the things that's amazing about the Savannah River site is when you look at the big picture, right. They're doing this constantly, right? Mm-hmm. So when you step back and you look at it from space, it's not just one big emerald. It's an emerald with lots of little spots in it, right? Mm-hmm. And so in the context of the larger landscape, having forests at different stages is really good for almost all the species that are there.
But how do you do that?
Yeah, it's how you do it. That's exactly right. It's how you do it. That's an issue that's highly controversial. If I lived next door to it, I wouldn't like it either.
Yeah.
Okay? Yes.
Thank you. Eleanor?
Eleanor Hobson Cab. As an educator, of course, Dr. Rhodes, educators love to hear about sustaining activities for children.
Yes, ma'am.
And the outdoor gardens are a wonderful idea. My concern is the amount awarded for those outdoor gardens, not nearly enough.
Right.
You have to spread it so thin. Is there any way that there can be an increase in the grants in that area, since we are worried about our environment, we want to save it, and we want the children to, of course, learn to do the same?
Well, it's supported by in-kind as well, right? So it is a minor amount of money really for what we're doing, but we also have our existing outreach program and our outreach personnel at SRL and at the Forest Service who contribute to it. So at least in terms of the personnel time, other monies are being leveraged, right? So other DOE and Forest Service monies are being leveraged to support it, so that some of the people that go out and help with this aren't being paid for out of that grant, but are being paid for by our other funds.
Good.
And the Forest Service down the road, if this works well, they may provide us with additional funds.
And not just the Forestry Service, perhaps the larger industries?
Yes.
In the area can
you would think.
Match.
And we haven't really gone out and sold it that way, but that's a good idea.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Doug Howard Cap.
Yes.
Great presentation, Dr. Rhodes.
Thank you.
When I was a young man, and I was a young man once,
we all were.
My brother and I, we used to catch bees, and we would get stung many times. So believe me, we got the point that you're talking about at an early age to leave the bees alone. But the first question that I have is, during the migratory route of these pollinators,
yes.
Where's the worst spot during that migratory route? Do you know that?
No, I don't, but I can make a hazarded guess. Okay, so for example, for migratory pollinators that are used in the central part of the United States, for example, we spend so much effort on food production there that we have really. When I lived in Indiana for 15 years, taught at Purdue, and it was from a perspective of agriculture, it was phenomenal. They had the breadbasket of the world kind of thing going on. But if you wanted to live in the fringe, there wasn't any. With GPS, precision agriculture, and those kinds of things, there just was no fringe habitat left. And that was by design, because they had the capability to use all of the landscape for the purpose that they wanted. So if you were a pollinator moving and you depended on what was going on in the Midwest to get where you wanted to go, you'd have a real hard time. We've seen the same thing, for example, with some of the duck species. So as we get better and better at what we do, sometimes we get so good that we really remove some of the critical elements for species. So that would be one. The other would be places where, as was pointed out earlier, where we have high levels of pesticide use. Some of those have long-term residuals, and so one of the traps, we call them ecological traps. So you're a pollinator and you're moving from point A to point B, and this looks like a beautiful place to stop and eat. Well, what it may be is a beautiful place to stop and eat that has been heavily treated with pesticides. And as soon as you go there, you die. So, and there's no way for you to know that's going to happen. So our ability, how we use pesticides also can take certain habitats away, but not actually change the habitat. It just makes it one that's a trap for those species. And we see that quite a bit too.
The last question I have is, you said that the United States has a national strategy to, I guess,
help recover pollinators.
Help recover. What about the rest of the world? I mean, how are they?
I don't know. That's another one that I don't know. I've really focused on, in preparation for this, I really focused on what we were doing, and I can't answer that question. I don't know that there aren't any. I think it's, let me hazard a guess. Some of the most developed countries probably do have, for example, I know that the beekeepers associations in Great Britain are heavily involved in this because they're seeing the same collapses. So some of the countries that have highly industrialized farm operations, I suspect they're already at the table. But whether there's a global agreement, I don't know if there's anything like that in place. But I do know that many of the highly industrialized countries that grow a lot of, that have agriculture, particularly precision agriculture, they're already involved.
Thank you.
Yeah. Do you want to add something to that?
Just one other comment, Larry Powell, Cap. I noticed, I read last week that Whole Foods, for like a 3-day period, and probably only in some stores, not all, had taken all the produce off their shelves for a 3 or 4 day period that were dependent on pollinators to make everybody aware of what a big impact it was.
Yeah, that's a good way to do it, because you just don't, I mean, I can get up here and talk about, you know, $10 billion worth of crops and all that stuff, but it doesn't really, till you see it on the grocery shelf, it doesn't ring home how much we depend on these guys. Thank you. Gil?
Gil Adams with CAB. Thank you, Dr. Rhodes. Following up on Doug.
Sure.
We concentrated on the United States, and you intimated that it's a problem other parts of the world. Is it a worldwide issue, or is it just developed, how you said, farms?
It depends on the nature of the problem, and so, I would argue that the problem, the disease problem, the pathogens, they could be worldwide, right? Okay. The statistics are frightening. So I did a stint with the USDA as an assistant director of the National Wildlife Research Center, and we looked at wildlife diseases globally. And by air, I don't think any place on the planet now is more than 24 hours from any other place. And so the cargo ships, I mean, the world is so connected that pathogens move freely, right? All right. So pathogens are an issue no matter where you are. The other is that once you find, as in a lot of developing countries, they freely use pesticides and herbicides that have been banned in other countries because of the health effects and environmental effects, because they work, right? They work, they're cheaper, they're an alternative market for those companies. So there could be significant pesticide issues in many of these countries that aren't highly developed agriculturally, just because it's an effective, cheap alternative for them. So I pointed out the Great Britain and maybe other highly industrialized countries simply because it's probably on their radar, and there are economies built around agriculture beyond just sustaining, right, oneself, but export. And I think it comes back to export. If you're an economy that's based on food export, then an issue like this is highly, highly economically important to you.
and I guess I'm just talking on, but it's confusing to me because the United States came through industrialization, and we, on that slide you showed, in I think going back to 46, we still had 6 million, whatever your statistic was, and it's just lowering, and so it's confusing because our pollution should be coming down, but that's not the issue.
Well, one of the things that falls in line with this is we also have a growing population, and we use more of the land. So what's really happening is we use more of the land, and what's left of it we also treat, right, with pesticides and other things. And part of the problem with many of the pesticides is that their shelf life, or in nature, could be 6 months to a year. So and all of that washes away, right? So when it rains, it moves to the ditch, it moves to the grass buffer, it moves, so it's all moving, right? So it's this complex, swirling mix of stuff that's moving around that we don't really have control of anymore. And that causes problems.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Rhodes.
You're welcome.
You guys ready to go to lunch now? Okay. Let's go ahead and go to lunch. Cab members who wanted to go to Edgar's Grill, please plan to go ahead and head over there. Huh? They signed up. They're going. If you raise your hand, you need to go and meet the reservation. Please be back in your seats at 12:30. We're going to reconvene at 12:30, please. Thank you.